The night of glass and smoke, she looked out at the sea of faces, every one of them touched by the same sickness of privileged men swollen with their own importance, women glittering with vanity so sharp it could cut glass. Isabel stood at the edge of it all, a pale wraith in borrowed silk, her hands steady as stone. She had been waiting for this night, shaping it in silence, building it piece by piece through years of labor and grief. Every breath she took now carried the weight of that waiting. The grand hall of the Ashfield estate shimmered under the chandelier's fractured light. Crystal droplets caught the glow like trapped stars, spilling their radiance over silk gowns and polished boots. Laughter rolled through the room too loud, too certain the sound of people who had never learned to whisper. The air smelled of wine, roasted meat, and smoke from the hundreds of candles lining the walls. It was a feast for those who had taken everything and forgotten the cost. Isabel moved among them like a shadow, silent, invisible. The fabric of her dress whispered faintly as she wove between tables, her face smooth, her eyes unreadable. Every pour of wine, every careful step, was deliberate part of a design she had etched into her mind long before the invitations were sent. She did not need to speak. The house did it for her, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the violins, the murmurs of arrogance dressed as conversation. Grateful, one woman purred, her voice slurred with wine. They should be grateful, don't you think, for the work, the shelter, the scraps. And laughter followed, soft and cruel, rippling like heat across the table. Isabel's expression never changed. She leaned forward, pouring deep red wine into a crystal glass, her reflection fractured in the liquid like a ghost staring back. Inside, her heart beat slow and steady, each pulse a quiet drumbeat mocking the moments until the world turned. Across the room she caught a flash of white Thomas Ashfield, the overseer. His pale eyes followed her every move, sharp and hungry. He had always watched her like that, the way men looked at things they believed they owned. She felt his gaze brush the back of her neck, a ghostly hand that once might have made her flinch. Not tonight. Tonight she moved with the calm precision of someone who had learned to stop being afraid. The musicians played faster now. Fiddles cried like morning birds as the guests spun and laughed, their skirts and coats a blur of motion and color. The chandeliers trembled slightly from the rhythm of the dancing, scattering flecks of gold across flushed faces. The air itself seemed alive, thrumming with heat, perfume, and power. Isabel paused near the banquet tables, her tray balanced effortlessly in her hands. Her gaze swept over the room the faces of those who had built their comfort from pain, their joy from others' suffering. Every name was etched into her memory like scars carved into flesh. She exhaled slowly. The night was almost ready. It began with a sound no one noticed, a faint, rough cough lost beneath the roar of the violins. A man lifted a hand to his throat, blinking, then laughed it off. Another sip of wine, another cough, then another. Isabel didn't look. She didn't need to. She could feel it spreading, a subtle tremor moving through the crowd like a whispered secret. Moments later, a goblet slipped from someone's fingers, shattering against the floor. Heads turned, a ripple of confusion. A woman swayed, her smile faltering. Somewhere near the head table, a chair scraped violently backward, followed by a strangled sound. Then silence. It came all at once, a vacuum that devoured music and laughter alike. The pianist's hands froze mid-note. The dancers stopped, caught mid-spin. And into that silence came the first scream, sharp, terrified, echoing off the marble walls. Isabel did not move. The hall erupted into chaos. Guests stumbled, coughing, clawing at their throats, their silk and velvet crumpling as they fell. The scent of perfume turned sour, mingling with the sharp tang of vomit and fear. The chandeliers still glowed, their light cruel and steady as the bodies began to drop beneath them. Through it all, Isabel stood perfectly still, her face a mask of serenity. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, the empty tray catching the candlelight like a mirror. In her eyes there was no triumph, only the stillness of something long buried finally breathing again. As the last notes of the violin faded into silence, she turned toward the door. Behind her, the grand hall of Ashfield was no longer a stage of laughter and light, it was a tomb of glass and smoke. And Isabel, silent as ever, walked away from the ruin she had made. The fire beneath the velvet sky, the night outside had turned heavy, swollen with the promise of rain. Beyond the tall windows, thunder murmured low against the horizon, rolling through the black Alabama fields. Inside, the air had curdled into something dense and poisonous, sweat, wine, and death tangled together. The grand hall of the Ashfield estate, once radiant with laughter, now pulsed with the sound of choking and glass breaking under trembling hands. Isabel stood among them, unmoving. The chandelier's light glinted off the sweat on her brow, but her gaze was steady, unbroken. Around her, the dying clutched at the tablecloths and polished floors, as though silk and marble could save them. The overseer staggered toward the door, his fingers clawing the air like a drowning man. He reached for her once, his lips shaping her name, but no sound came. He fell, his body striking the table with a dull, final thud. She didn't flinch. The music had stopped, yet the echo of the violins seemed to hang there still, a phantom melody woven into the smoke. The room itself trembled, as if the house could feel what was coming. Isabel inhaled deeply. Beneath the metallic tang of blood and the bitter sweetness of wine, she could smell it. Kerosene. Hours earlier, before the first carriage had arrived, she had walked the corridors alone, her lantern burning low, her apron damp with the scent of oil. Every corner she passed had been marked: the baseboards, the curtains, the storeroom door. The work of quiet hands and a patient heart. The fire had never been an afterthought. It was the ending she had always promised. A faint crackle echoed from the far hall. It was soft, almost polite, a whisper of flame catching a dry curtain. Then came another, sharper, hungrier. Isabel turned her head toward the sound. A thin ribbon of smoke curled along the ceiling beams, graceful, deliberate. It spread with the same patience she had learned to survive with. Panic began to ripple again through the survivors. Those who could still stand stumbled toward the exits, only to find the heavy doors locked from within. Isabel had seen to that, too. Their shouts rose, desperate, wordless. A woman in a gown, the color of emeralds, threw herself against the window, her jeweled hands leaving streaks of blood on the glass. It didn't break. Nothing in this house ever broke easily. The first flames reached the drapes. The velvet caught with a sigh, then roared upward in a rush of light. The fire moved fast, greedy and bright, licking across the walls like a living thing. Shadows danced along the gilded frames of portraits, pale faces twisting as if alive, their painted smiles melting into the heat. Isabel walked through the smoke like a ghost come home. Her steps were slow, her skirts brushing the scorched floorboards, her eyes fixed ahead. The crimson stains on her apron had darkened almost to black, but her face was untouched by soot or ash. She passed through the ballroom without looking down. There was nothing left to see, only the fallen and the dying, their once fine voices reduced to ragged breaths. A portrait of her mother hung in the parlor, not a painting, but a memory pressed into the walls. She could still see her there, years ago, pouring tea for men who never used her name. Isabel paused in that doorway now, her face unreadable. The fire had reached the room, winding around the carved furniture, devouring the lace curtains, swallowing the piano's keys one by one. She whispered, not to the flames, but to the ghosts, "It's done." The storm outside broke then, as if the sky itself had been waiting. Rain lashed the windows, streaking the soot-stained glass. Lightning tore through the clouds, its white flash turning the house into a skeleton of light and shadow. But the downpour couldn't touch the fire within. The inferno raged on, devouring the past, feeding on every board, every lie, every stolen moment that had built this place. The great staircase cracked, the railing collapsing in a spray of sparks. The chandeliers crashed down one by one, their crystal teeth scattering across the floor like stars dying. The roof moaned, its timbers snapping. Isabel reached the front doors, the ones carved with the Ashfield crest, the mark of every cruelty she'd endured. The flames had reached them now, curling around the letters, blistering the gold leaf until it peeled away. She lifted a hand, pressed her palm against the burning wood, and pushed. The doors gave way with a heavy groan, spilling her into the storm. Rain hit her face, cold and sharp. The air outside was thick with smoke and the scent of wet earth. Behind her, the house burned like a beacon against the night, the fire's glow reflecting in her dark eyes. The storm howled, the wind pulling at her hair, but she stood still, letting it wash over her. The Ashfield estate, her prison, her inheritance, her curse was collapsing. Each beam that fell sounded like a heartbeat fading away. Sparks spiraled into the sky, carried by the wind across the empty fields. She watched until the roof caved, until the windows burst in showers of flame and rain, and then she turned. The road stretched before her, a black ribbon glistening with rain, leading into the mist beyond the cotton fields. She took her first step forward steady, unhurried. The mud clung to her shoes, the cold seeped into her bones, but she felt lighter than she had in years. Behind her, the fire roared one final time, a sound like the earth exhaling. The house that had taken everything from her was gone. All that remained was smoke, rain, and the steady rhythm of her footsteps fading into the storm. The field of quiet echoes by the time the storm began to thin. The night had folded into an uneasy stillness. The wind had lost its rage, leaving behind only the soft hiss of rain falling through smoke. The great house was nearly gone, the skeleton of its upper floors sagging inward, a single chimney standing like a gravestone over what had been. The air shimmered with heat, rain turning to steam as it struck the smoldering wreckage. Isabel stood at the edge of the veranda, or what remained of it just a strip of charred wood clinging to the foundation. The light from the flames had dimmed to a dull orange glow, painting the world in the color of old blood. Her dress hung heavy, soaked through, clinging to her legs as she stepped down into the mud. The field stretched wide before her, the wet earth reflecting the firelight in shallow pools. Beyond it, the rows of cotton lay flattened, trampled by wind and men and fear. The air was thick with the scent of burnt linen and iron. Somewhere in the distance, a horse cried out once and then went silent. She moved forward, slow and certain, her bare feet sinking into the softened ground. Behind her, the last timbers of the estate collapsed with a hollow crash, sending up a fresh plume of sparks. She didn't turn back. She had no need to watch it die. The first body she passed was the overseer's. He lay half, buried in the muck, his fine coat soaked black, his hand outstretched toward the ruined house as though still trying to command it. His eyes were open, glassy and gray. Isabel looked down at him only once before stepping past. He had always carried the keys to the quarters around his neck. She had counted each one as he slept. Now they hung uselessly against his throat, glinting faintly in the dying firelight. She kept walking. The further she went, the quieter the world became. Even the rain seemed to hush as she moved between the rows. The fields that had once echoed with shouting, with the crack of the whip, with the rustle of labor, were now still. The soil, dark and slick, carried the weight of something older than blood memory pressed deep into its roots. Halfway across the field, she stopped. The tree line loomed in the distance, a dark wall against the gray horizon. That line of pines had always marked the end of her world, the place she'd been forbidden to cross. As a child, she'd watched the sky beyond them and wondered what kind of air lay on the other side, what kind of silence. Now that same silence wrapped around her like a shroud. She glanced down. Beneath her feet, the ground was streaked with ash and rainwater, a black river winding between the remnants of the harvest. Scattered in the mud were pieces of lives, a broken shoe, a gold button, a string of pearls torn apart. The world that had owned her was disassembled, piece by piece. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Near the far edge of the field, something stirred, a figure dragging itself upright among the rows. For a moment, she thought it was smoke rising again, but then it took shape. One of the overseer's men, his face streaked with soot, his hands shaking. He was young, too young to have done the things he had done, but his eyes were old, hollowed by cruelty. He saw her and froze. The two of them stood there in the wet dawn, the only living souls in a world of ruin. "You," he rasped, the word breaking in his throat. "You did this." She said nothing. The rifle, slick with rain, was still in her hands. She lifted it slowly, her expression unreadable. The storm had quieted enough that the sound of her breath was audible, calm, even, steady. The man staggered forward, his boots sinking deep into the muck. "Please," he choked out. "Please, miss." The rifle cracked once. The sound echoed across the empty fields, sharp and clean. He fell face, burst into the mud, the echo rolling into the distance until it dissolved into the rain. Isabel lowered the weapon, the barrel smoking faintly in the damp air. For a long while she didn't move. Then quietly she began walking again, her pace slow, deliberate, toward the dark line of trees waiting at the far edge of the field. The horizon was just beginning to pale. Dawn, gray and thin, crept along the clouds. The fire behind her dimmed to embers. She crossed the last row, her footsteps soft, her breath steady. At the threshold of the woods she paused only once to look at the land that had held her, broken her and burned for her. The world was silent now, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion, a silence earned. Then Isabel turned toward the forest and walked into the shadows, her figure fading against the mist. Behind her, the Ashfield estate sank into its own smoke, the air heavy with the scent of rain and ash and freedom. The ashes and the pines' dawn crept over Ashfield like a weary sigh, its light muted by the veil of smoke that hung low across the land. The rain had quieted to a mist, whispering against the charred remains of what had once been grandeur. The great house was gone, its columns collapsed, its iron gates melted into blackened shapes. Only the chimney stood, crooked and tall, a grave marker against the pale horizon. The ground still steamed. Pools of rainwater shimmered with oil and ash, and the smell of smoke clung to the air like a memory that refused to fade. Crows gathered along the fence posts, silent sentinels watching over ruin. Nothing moved, save for the thin ribbons of vapor rising from the scorched fields. Then from the edge of the pines a figure emerged, Isabel. Her bare feet sank into the wet soil with each step, leaving shallow impressions that filled instantly with dark water. Her dress, once gray, was streaked with mud, the hem torn. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the sudden stillness of a world without sound. She paused near what had been the veranda, her gaze sweeping the wreckage. Everything that had once held power here, every cruel word, every chain, every command, had been reduced to soot. The overseer's rifle lay half, buried nearby, its barrel twisted by heat. The dining room's silver, blackened and warped, glimmered faintly among the ashes, and the portraits, those painted faces of the Ashfield family, had melted into the walls, their colors running together in grotesque rivulets. The faces that had once looked down on her now dripped into the floor. Isabel knelt. The earth beneath her was soft, warm still from the fire's heart. She pressed her palm into it, the wetness seeping between her fingers. For the first time in her life, the ground did not feel like punishment. It felt alive, breathing. A faint wind stirred through the ruins, carrying with it the scent of pine and wet clay. She lifted her head toward the tree line. The pines loomed tall and silent, their shadows long and dark, their tops swaying gently in the morning light. That line had always marked the edge of her world, the border between captivity and something unnamed. Now it called to her, not with promise, but with possibility. She rose. The world around her was a quiet graveyard of memory. Bits of lace clung to the blackened hedges. A single shoe, a ring, a child's doll lay scattered in the mud. A broken carriage wheel leaned against a tree, still smoking faintly. Isabel moved among these remnants without slowing, her expression unreadable, her steps steady. Each object she passed seemed to fade further into the mist, until the land itself looked like a ghost. Near the field's edge she paused once more. Her reflection rippled in a puddle at her feet. Soot, streaked hollow-eyed yet unbroken. A breath escaped her lips, quiet and even. She did not look back again. Behind her, the last of the estate's roof collapsed with a distant groan, sending up a plume of cinders that shimmered like fireflies before vanishing into the gray sky. The birds startled and rose in a sudden black wave, their wings cutting through the fog. By the time she reached the first line of trees, the sun had begun to pierce through the clouds. Shafts of light filtered down through the branches, scattering across her face and the wet ground. She stopped at the threshold, one hand resting against the rough bark of a pine. The forest beyond stretched deep and quiet, a cathedral of green shadows. For a long moment she stood there, breathing in the damp scent of needles and wildflowers, the faint sweetness of something untouched. Her eyes softened, though her shoulders did not. Then she stepped forward. The forest swallowed her without a sound. Hours later, as the day grew brighter, a handful of riders arrived from the neighboring parish. They were drawn by the column of smoke that had blackened the sky since midnight. What they found silenced even the most hardened among them. The estate, once the pride of the county, was now a ruin. The ashes were still warm, the air still thick with heat. They found no survivors, only bones, embers, and the faint outline of footprints leading away from the fire and toward the woods. They followed the tracks for a time, but the trail vanished where the pines thickened. Some said the woman they sought had escaped north, boarding a train before dawn. Others whispered that the forest had taken her, that the trees themselves had closed around her, keeping her secrets. As evening fell, the searchers returned to what remained of the house. One of them, a preacher's son, claimed he heard singing carried on the wind, a low, humming hymn rising from the woods. The others laughed uneasily, but none of them stayed past dusk. The air grew colder then, heavy with the kind of quiet that makes a man lower his voice. And when they rode away, the smoke behind them thinned into the pale sky, carrying the first whispers of a story that would soon spread far beyond those scorched fields. A story of a woman who walked out of the fire and vanished into the pines, leaving behind nothing but ashes and silence. The records of Ashfield, the story of Ashfield, did not die with the fire. By the time the smoke had cleared and the ashes cooled, whispers had already begun to spread beyond the county lines. They moved through taverns and church pews, across train depots and courthouse step, tales spoken in half, voices, each retelling bending closer to myth. When the officials arrived from Montgomery 3 days later, they found little left to record. The once grand house was nothing but blackened ribs jutting from the mud, its foundation cracked and smoking. Every ledge, every step, every remnant of luxury was gone, melted, broken, or buried. The ledger room had collapsed into the cellar, its shelves of records burned to dust. All except one. A single page had survived, half seared, its ink blurred but still legible. A list of names, 37 in total. The Ashfield household, their guests, and the servants who had attended the ball that night. Every one of them marked dead, every name except one, Isabel. The investigators found no sign of her body among the remains. At first, they assumed she'd been reduced to ash, her bones unrecognizable. But then came the tracks, barefoot impressions in the mud, leading away from the wreckage and into the pine woods. They followed them for nearly half a mile before the prints vanished into the thick carpet of needles. The ground beyond was undisturbed. A local sheriff, hardened by decades of moonshine raids and feuds, insisted they continue deeper, but the search dogs refused to move past the tree line. They whined and pulled away, their hackles raised, as if something unseen waited beyond the first row of pines. After an hour of circling the area, the men gave up and returned to the ruins, silent and uneasy. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as unknown chemical poisoning followed by fire, yet none of them could agree on the order. Some victims had been found near the main hall with blackened throats and glassy eyes, suggesting poison. Others were burned beyond recognition. A few lay near the edge of the property, seemingly untouched by flame or smoke, as though they had simply stopped. Newspapers seized on the mystery. The Fall of Ashfield. One headline read, "The Servant's Revenge," declared another. Most printed the version that sold best, that a young servant woman had been humiliated by her employers, and in a moment of madness had set the estate ablaze. Others claimed she was no ordinary woman at all, but the spirit of every soul broken on Ashfield's land, a phantom given form by rage. Weeks passed, and still no one found her, but strange stories began to surface. A farmer plowing his southern field swore he saw a figure at dawn, woman standing just inside the tree line, her dress the color of storm clouds, her face pale and distant. When he blinked, she was gone, and in her place he found a single footprint pressed deep into the soil. A preacher's wife, walking home from the river, said she heard a woman's voice humming a hymn older than memory. The sound was soft, steady, carried by the wind that stirred the reeds. She followed it for a time, only to find herself at the edge of the burnt estate, staring at the broken chimney silhouetted against the moon. Even the lawmen spoke of unease. The sheriff, who had once demanded they press deeper into the forest, began to drink heavily after the fire. He told his deputy that he'd woken one night to find muddy footprints across his porch, small, bare, and leading away toward the pines. The next morning, he left town without a word and was never seen again. In the years that followed, the Ashfield land changed hands many times. Some tried to rebuild, but each effort ended the same way. Unexplained fires, tools gone missing, and workers who swore they heard footsteps behind them when the wind blew from the north. Eventually, the property was abandoned, its boundaries overrun by wildflowers and moss. Still, people spoke of her, not with pity, but with reverence. Isabel had become something larger than vengeance, something elemental. They said the land had chosen her, that her rage had bled into the soil and her silence into the air, that the fire had not destroyed her but bound her to the place she had freed. And on the rare nights when the mist rolled thick and the moon hid behind clouds, travelers claimed to hear a single gunshot echo from the woods, followed by the faint hum of a woman's voice, soft and unending, a sound like memory refusing to die. The return to Ashfield, the records of Ashfield slept undisturbed for nearly a century. Dust gathered on their brittle pages, the ink fading to sepia, the names curling at their edges like dried leaves. The estate itself was swallowed by time, its fences rotted, its wells filled, and the great chimney overtaken by ivy. Only the oldest families of the parish still spoke of it, and even then, only after dark, when the air was still and the lamps burned low. It was in the summer of 1931 that the matter was stirred again. The Department of State Archives in Montgomery had undertaken an initiative to catalog sites of Southern catastrophe, a project of academic curiosity dressed in the language of public record. Among the assigned scholars was Dr. Nathaniel Ward, a historian of modest repute known for his work on plantation genealogies. His handwriting, cramped and deliberate, fills the margins of the Ashfield folder to this day. He arrived at the parish on June 12, 1931, describing the area as overgrown, soundless, and peculiarly still, as though the very birds refused to mark the place. The locals received him with the courteous suspicion reserved for outsiders. When he asked for directions to the estate, most claimed ignorance. Only one man, a gray-haired surveyor named Elias Brooke, offered to guide him, though not without warning. "People don't last long out there," Brooks said, his voice low. "The ground remembers." Ward dismissed the remark as superstition. He was a man of documents, of facts, of verifiable patterns. Yet the further he walked down the dirt road that once led to the estate, the more the logic of the world seemed to bend around him. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and smoke, though no fires burned. The trees pressed close together, their trunks pale and damp. By the time they reached the clearing, the afternoon light had dimmed to a ghostly yellow. What he found astonished him. The outline of the mansion was still visible, a faint grid of stone, like bones beneath skin. The chimney stood intact, cloaked in moss and vine. Near its base, he uncovered fragments of charred porcelain, the corner of a metal frame, and the melted shape of a bell. But what unsettled him most was the silence. Even the insects seemed to avoid the ruin. Brooks refused to linger. He left Ward there with a curt nod, muttering something about sundown. Ward, determined to finish his survey before dark, began sketching the foundations. He noted in his journal, "The house appears to have collapsed inward. Stone steps lead nowhere. A cellar door half buried in mud remains intact. Air from beneath smells faintly of iron." That night, in the parish inn, he was unable to sleep. His dreams were fevered, filled with the crackle of fire and the echo of voices he could not place. When he woke, he found his hands streaked with soot. He assumed it came from handling the debris earlier, but his notebook, which he'd left closed on the desk, bore the imprint of a single muddy hand. Still, he returned the next morning. Curiosity had hardened into obsession. He pried open the cellar door. The hinges shrieked like something alive. Inside, the air was cool and dry, as though sealed for 100 years. The steps led down into what remained of the wine vault, its shelves empty save for one bottle, unbroken, its glass blackened by smoke. Dust motes swam in his lantern's light. At the far end of the chamber he found what appeared to be a journal, its leather warped but its pages intact. The first line read, "June 17th, 1834. My name is Isabel." Ward's handwriting grows unsteady in the next section of his notes. He wrote that the text was part confession, part recollection, pages describing the cruelty of the house, the laughter of the master, the strange illness that took the servants, and the night of fire. The later entries were fragmented, the sentences broken, as though written in haste. One passage, underlined twice, read, "The soil breathes beneath the house. I have heard it call my name." Ward did not sleep that night either. He wrote until dawn, cataloguing every word, sketching every page. By his third day in the parish, he was visibly changed. Pale, hollow-eyed, his speech clipped and feverish. When Brooks returned to check on him, he found the scholar standing in the ruins barefoot, his coat discarded, whispering to something in the air. That evening, Ward returned to town and sent a telegram to Montgomery. Subject site exhibits significant anthropological interest. Request permission for extended study. There is movement beneath the earth. No one ever received a reply. A week later, the parish sheriff found Ward's camp abandoned. His lantern still burned, his journal open to a final entry dated June 18th. She walks still. The fire did not end her. It preserved her. The next page was blank, except for a single print of ash where a hand might have rested. The Ashfield manuscript, as it came to be called, arrived at the Montgomery archives wrapped in oilcloth and bound with twine. The package bore no sender's name, only a single return mark from the rural parish where Dr. Ward had last been seen. Inside were two items, Ward's field journal and the warped leather book he had reportedly discovered beneath the ruins. Both were streaked with soot. The paper smelled faintly of iron and pine. Archivist Margaret Ellis received the parcel on July 3, 1931. Her accession notes begin formally enough: catalog numbers, condition assessments, ink composition analysis. But her tone shifts abruptly after the first entry. On the third page her handwriting slants, the words growing faint and erratic. When handled, the pages seem warm. The edges darken as though the ink is still drying. There is a faint sound, like humming, when the book is closed. The manuscript contained 31 pages in total. The first half chronicled the life of a woman enslaved on the Ashfield estate during the early 1008. Hundred's her name, spelled variously as Isabel, Usable, or Isabel. Her entries were composed in a clear, deliberate hand, alternating between prayer, description, and observation. The tone was neither bitter nor self-pitying, but coldly factual, an accounting of pain with the restraint of someone who had learned to survive by silence. She wrote of Dr. Lucian Ashfield, the master's brother, whose interests lay not in crops or trade, but in the secret orders of the body. She described experiments, drawings of lungs, dissections of animals, and later, of people. The servants whispered that he sought the seat of the soul, and that he believed the human voice could trap it. Isabel's own tasks grew stranger over time, tending to the doctor's journals, cleaning surgical instruments, and recording observations of patients who never seemed to leave the basement laboratory. Her writing becomes disjointed by the midpoint. Dates are missing. Lines begin and trail off mid-thought. Several pages are smeared with what appears to be dried blood. Then, abruptly, the narrative changes tense, from past to present. The air beneath the house breathes like a creature. When the doctor sleeps, I hear whispering through the pipes. He says it is gas, but the voices know my name. They know all of ours. He made me watch. He said the body must be open to release the darkness. He said the ash in our lungs was proof that the curse was within us, not upon us. Tonight the soil moved. Something beneath it turned. The final third of the book appears to have been written in a single sitting. Ink heavy, handwriting slanted and uneven. The words crowd the page as if she were racing to finish before something reached her. He found what he sought. He said the soul is a sound, a frequency so low it hums beneath the heart. He made a chamber for it beneath the cellar, lined with glass and copper. He said the walls would sing. The house is not burning yet, but I smell smoke. It comes from the earth. The voices are no longer beneath, they are within. When I breathe, they breathe. The final line before the abrupt stop reads, "The fire will free us all." Margaret Ellis's final archival note was written 2 days after she began transcribing. The words appear to shift on rereading. Where I recall lungs, it now reads tongues. The ink does not fade evenly. There is residue on my fingertips when I close the book, dark like soot but sticky to the touch. I will deliver it to the preservation lab on Monday. I cannot keep it in my office any longer. She did not deliver it. On July 6th, Ellis was found collapsed in the archive's sub-basement, her chair overturned, the manuscript open on the floor beside her. She was breathing shallowly, her pupils dilated. When asked what had happened, she whispered, "It's still humming." She died before midnight of sudden cardiac arrest. The attending physician reported a faint odor of smoke emanating from her hair and clothing. The book was sealed in a lead container and transferred to the restricted holdings. Official documentation states it was destroyed by fire in 1942 during a warehouse accident. Yet photographs of the incident show the container unscathed amid the wreckage, its metal surface blackened but intact. The label reads in Ward's unmistakable hand, "Isabel, the voice of Ashfield." The chamber beneath the following section of Dr. Ward's recovered notes is difficult to verify, yet its handwriting and phrasing are consistent with the rest of his journals. The entry bears the date October 12, 1931, 3 months after Margaret Ellis's death, and nearly a century after the supposed destruction of the Ashfield estate. I was wrong to assume the ruin was empty. Ward described his arrival at the property under the pretext of geological survey work. The land had reverted to the county decades before, overgrown, silent, littered with stone foundations buried beneath vines. The cellar doors had been sealed with iron bolts, yet the air above them trembled faintly, as if from distant machinery. He pried the locks loose and descended by lantern. The steps were slick with condensation, the walls lined with slate. Beneath, he found a tunnel leading east, an addition not present in any of the original estate maps. He wrote of the smell first, a copper tang, sweet and animal, like air drawn from a grave. The tunnel opened into a low chamber of brick and mortar. In its center stood a structure shaped roughly like an organ, its pipes of tarnished brass rising into the ceiling. Glass jars hung suspended by wire, each filled with a dark viscous fluid. Within several of them floated human tongues, gray, shrunken, the veins blackened like roots. Beneath the central console, a circular basin of stone collected dripping condensation. The sound Ward described was faint but unmistakable, a slow, rhythmic vibration that resonated through the soles of his boots. The chamber hums. It hums in a key just below perception. When I close my eyes, it aligns with my heartbeat. He recorded the dimensions, the materials, even sketched the mechanisms. Yet his tone shifts halfway through. I found something embedded in the far wall, a name scratched with a nail, Isabel. The final letter curves downward as if carved in haste. The mortar surrounding it pulses slightly, almost imperceptibly. I touched it once. It was warm. The next section of his writing degenerates into shorthand and symbols, notations of pitch, frequency, blood ratios. Between the lines he writes single words, disjointed, without context, transference, echo, mouths, containment. When the entry resumes in full sentences, his voice is no longer clinical. It reads like confession. He was right. Lucian Ashfield was not searching for the soul. He was trying to trap its residue, the sound left behind when life departs the flesh. The servants he experimented on, he called them vessels of vibration. Their deaths fed this machine, each tongue preserved not for study, but for resonance. He built a choir of the dead. Ward wrote that he turned one of the brass valves, and the hum deepened, swelling into a low human tone. For several seconds, he believed he heard multiple voices blending, male, female, child, chanting in intervals too precise to be natural. The lantern flame flickered blue. The air thickened, pushing against him like a slow breath. It spoke, though not in words. It remembered being beneath the soil. It remembered smoke. The next paragraph is written in trembling script. She is still here, the woman called Isabel. She is not haunting this place. She is woven into it. Her final breath was caught by the device, the sound preserved in perpetual vibration. She does not rest. She moves in frequency, through soil, through blood, through memory. The Ashfields believe they could control it, but it controls the living. It sings through them. Ward's final coherent note describes the lantern extinguishing by itself. He reports hearing movement behind the walls, as if many small bodies were turning over in the earth. He attempted to flee, but found the stairway sealed from above. His last intelligible line before the journal breaks off reads, "It is not the dead that haunt us. It is the sound of their release." When authorities later investigated the site, the entrance to the cellar had collapsed entirely. Ward's lantern and boots were recovered at the threshold, but no remains were found. The stone basin, described in his notes, was discovered intact, filled to its brim with clear water. When disturbed, it emitted a faint, sustained note, an impossible resonance for an object with no visible source of vibration. The basin now resides in the State Museum's restricted archive under catalog number MA 1931-14, labeled only Acoustic Vessel Origin Unknown. The resonance, the first to report symptoms, was Professor Charles Greaves, curator of the Montgomery Museum's historical collection. He had supervised the transfer of the Ashfield Basin to its climate-controlled vault in December 1931. Within 2 weeks, staff noted his growing disorientation, pausing mid-sentence, claiming to hear singing from within the floorboards. His colleagues dismissed it as exhaustion. Then one morning the guards found him standing barefoot in the vault, both hands pressed to the container's surface, humming in a tone so low it rattled the shelves. He was hospitalized shortly after. His attending physician recorded a steady, irregular vibration in Greaves' throat, as though his vocal cords were resonating without airflow. He could not be restrained from mouthing one phrase again and again, "She's still breathing through us." Within a month, 2 additional staff members were admitted under similar conditions, mild auditory hallucinations, escalating to physical tremors when near the artifact. The museum officially blamed chemical exposure from preservation solvents, but internal memos tell a different story. One technician wrote, "When the basin hums, the lights dim in unison. It is not sound, it is pressure. It feels as though the air itself flexes, pulling toward it." By February 1932, the board ordered the artifact sealed in a lead-lined crate. The symptoms abated immediately, yet reports persisted that the humming continued, faint but measurable, at precisely 43 Hz, the same frequency registered in Dr. Ward's final notes. A series of low-frequency studies were conducted later that spring by Dr. Vernon Hale of Auburn University. His report was never published, but fragments survive in correspondence with his assistant. The vibration induces panic, nausea, and temporary aphasia in 62% of subjects. Heart rates synchronize with the waveform. Several subjects reported the sensation of being observed from within their own chests. Hale grew obsessed. He theorized the resonance was not sound, but a biological carrier, an encoded memory in air. He wrote that the human body, with its chambers and fluids, could amplify this tone naturally. In one surviving letter, his handwriting falters halfway through. The frequency is ancient. It predates speech. The woman's name, Miss Abel, appears in the harmonics. Her voice is the bass line. After his death in 1933, his laboratory was cleared. The crate containing the basin was gone. There is no record of its removal. For nearly 50 years, nothing more was written of the Ashfield object. Then, in 1982, a private collector named Henry Callow donated a brass valve mechanism found near the Ashfield property to the Montgomery Museum's Restoration Fund. Within weeks, archivist Laura Ames noted a low vibration emanating from the piece whenever the basement dehumidifiers engaged. She recorded the sound on magnetic tape. The waveform displayed a recurring modulation that analysts later identified as a human voice whispering beneath the hum, possibly faint, yet articulate. When amplified, the voice spoke 8 discernible words: "I remember the fire. I remember the field." The tape was archived, then misplaced. Ames resigned shortly thereafter. In her exit statement, she wrote only, "It's not gone. It's moving through frequencies we cannot hear." Modern researchers who have studied the case describe the phenomenon as acoustic contagion, a vibration capable of imprinting upon the listener's neurology. Those who have heard recordings of the hum report identical dreams: a field of blackened soil, a woman walking into the trees at dawn, and the faint pull of a breath not their own. The Ashfield property itself remains fenced and unmarked. No birds nest there. Locals say the air around the ruins grows heavy after rain, as though the ground still exhales smoke. Sometimes, they claim, the soil trembles, not from wind or thunder, but from something deep beneath, shifting in slow rhythm, as though the land itself were breathing in time with the dead. In recent years, audio technicians restoring 1930's field recordings have noted interference patterns consistent with the Ashfield frequency. The pattern appears across multiple reels from different counties, decades apart, as if the sound had bled into the medium itself. One archivist swore she heard a woman's voice on the static, low and steady. "I never left the chamber." Those who have listened say the tone lingers long after playback stops. The walls seem to pulse faintly, glass panes vibrating with invisible current. Some report pressure in the chest, as if the heartbeat aligns with something older, deeper, and waiting to be heard. And still, beneath every account, one refrain persists, unchanged since the first transcription in 1834. "The fire will free us all." The aftermath, the last official record connected to the Ashfield case, dates to August 1978. A maintenance crew restoring the Montgomery Museum's electrical system discovered an unlisted sub-basement, its doorway sealed behind a false wall of plaster and steel. Inside, they found shelves of rusted instruments, boxes of disintegrating paper, and at the center, the Ashfield crate, unbroken, its label still legible through a film of dust. Acoustic vessel origin unknown. The crew chief, Elliot Rains, later reported that the air within the room felt alive, like the low hum before lightning. The men heard what they described as a single sustained note, coming from the crate. One worker attempted to record it on a portable cassette deck. The tape captured 6 seconds of silence followed by a woman's exhale. The sound was soft, human, and terribly near. 3 days later, Rains was found dead in his apartment. The cause: cardiac arrest, his eyes open, his expression, according to police, as if he were listening. The tape recorder remained by his bedside, still running, its reels empty but faintly vibrating. After that, the sub-basement was sealed again under state order. The museum's public statement blamed toxic mold exposure. No reference to the artifact or its properties appeared in official correspondence after 1980. Yet, within academic circles, rumors persisted of an internal memo circulated privately among curators. Its final line, attributed to director James Alcott, read, "Whatever it is, it's learning to travel through sound itself." By 1994, the legend had migrated online. Early message boards devoted to historical oddities shared low-quality scans of Ward's journal and fragments of the Ashfield hum, said to have been digitized from Rains's cassette. Users described headaches, insomnia, and one consistent auditory hallucination: a woman's breathing just behind the left ear. Some claimed the sound file grew longer each time it was played. Others swore they heard their own names whispered beneath the hum. Attempts to trace the original uploader led nowhere. The account had been deleted within 24 hours. But the file continued to appear on mirrored servers across Europe and the southern United States, sometimes renamed, sometimes embedded in field recordings, always identical at its core. A low vibration at 43 Hz, cycling precisely every 10 seconds. Audio engineers who analyzed it noted an irregular modulation in the lower bands. When slowed to 1/4 speed, the modulation formed distinct syllables, aligning phonetically with the word Isabel. In 2003, a graduate researcher named Marina Holt attempted a controlled playback using anechoic chamber equipment. Her report, unfinished, was recovered from her personal computer following her disappearance. It ends mid-sentence. The frequency shifts as though responding to pulse rate. It mimics breath. I think it's matching. Her body was never found. Only, the recording remained. 4 minutes of faint mechanical hum, followed by the unmistakable sound of a woman's voice whispering, "Don't open the door." Today, the Ashfield property lies swallowed by pines once more. Locals still refuse to enter after dusk. Travelers who linger near the old boundary report the faint scent of smoke when no fire burns, and the pressure of a heartbeat in the soil beneath their feet. At night, if the air is still, some say the wind carries the trace of a hymn, melody without words, rising and falling like breath. Others speak of a figure glimpsed between the trees, moving soundlessly toward the field, her dress pale, her hair matted with ash. Historians dismiss it as folklore. Skeptics call it mass suggestion, but on the archived copy of the final field recording, catalogued as a May 1931-14, digitized in 2019, voice still lingers in the closing seconds, quiet but clear enough to transcribe. I walked into the trees once. I'm still walking. And then, barely audible, something lower answers back. Hundreds of overlapping tones, the echo of voices resonating in impossible harmony. The fire will free us all. The recording ends there. But those who have heard it swear the hum never truly stops. If you sit in silence long enough, it finds your pulse, syncs with it, until you can't tell if the sound is coming from the world outside or from within your own chest.